3 daggers, 3 sisters, 1 emperor who believed he was a god. What could possibly go wrong? It's 39 years after the birth of Christ, and the Roman Empire is ruled by absolute terror. The marble halls of the Palatine Hill echo with screams, while the most powerful women in the ancient world huddle in secret, plotting the unthinkable. Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla, sisters who once shared the emperor's bed, now sharpen their knives for his back. Their target? Their own brother, Caligula, the man who turned Rome into his personal playground of horrors, the tyrant who declared himself a living god and made senators bow to his horse, the monster who pushed the mighty Roman Empire to the very brink of collapse. But here's the chilling question that haunts this tale. What drives someone to risk everything, their lives, their families, their very souls, to bring down a monster who also happens to be family? When does love turn to hatred so pure that murder becomes the only solution? You see, blood might be thicker than water, but power corrupts even the strongest family bonds. And in the twisted world of imperial Rome, where brothers became lovers and sisters became assassins, nothing was sacred. Today, here on Imperium Chronicles, we're diving deep into one of history's most shocking family betrayals, the 3 Daggers plot. This isn't just another assassination story. This is the conspiracy that exposed Caligula's madness to the world and sealed the fate of Rome's first imperial dynasty. It's a tale of betrayal so intimate, so brutal, that it would make Shakespeare weep. We'll uncover the twisted psychology behind this plot, reveal the dark secrets that drove these powerful women to the edge, and explore how their failed assassination attempt actually made Caligula even more dangerous. This is a story of lust, power, and daggers, hidden in the shadows of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Don't miss this epic journey into the darkest corners of ancient Rome. Hit that like button, share this story with anyone who loves history's most shocking tales, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more stories that shaped our world. Ring that notification bell, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next in our exploration of power, betrayal, and the price of absolute corruption. Now, to understand why 3 sisters would plot to murder their own brother, we need to journey back to how this monster was created. Because believe it or not, Caligula wasn't always the bloodthirsty tyrant who terrorized Rome. Once upon a time, he was actually beloved. Picture this: a charming little boy running around Roman military camps, wearing tiny soldier boots that earned him the nickname Caligula, which literally means little boots. The soldiers adored him. The people of Rome saw him as their golden child, the future of the empire. When he became emperor in 37 years after Christ, Romans celebrated in the streets. They threw parties, sacrificed animals to the gods, and genuinely believed their prayers had been answered. But here's where our story takes a sinister turn. Just months into his reign, something happened that changed everything. Caligula fell mysteriously ill. Some historians believe it was encephalitis, a brain infection that can literally alter personality. Others whisper about poison, political intrigue, or even divine punishment. Whatever it was, the man who recovered from that sickbed was not the same person who had fallen ill. The transformation was terrifying to witness. Imagine waking up one day to discover that your beloved leader had become a monster overnight. That's exactly what happened to Rome. First came the megalomania. Caligula didn't just want to be emperor. He declared himself a living god. He ordered temples built in his honor and demanded that people worship him. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just political theater. He genuinely believed he was divine, equal to Jupiter himself. He would have conversations with statues of the gods, treating them like old friends at a dinner party. But the madness was just getting started. One of his first acts was to order the execution of his own cousin, Tiberius Gemellus. This wasn't some distant relative. This was family, someone who had grown up alongside him. The boy was barely out of his teens when Caligula had him killed, claiming he was a threat to the throne. And then there's the story that still makes historians scratch their heads in disbelief. Caligula supposedly appointed his horse, Incitatus as a senator. Now some scholars debate whether he actually went through with this or if it was just his twisted way of mocking the Senate. But here's the terrifying part. Nobody was brave enough to question him about it. Can you imagine sitting in the Roman Senate, the most powerful legislative body in the world, and having to treat a horse as your equal? The horse, by the way, lived better than most Romans. Incitatus had a marble stable, an ivory feeding trough, and purple blankets. Caligula threw dinner parties for the animal and claimed it gave him political advice. Whether this was madness or the ultimate insult to Roman dignity, it showed just how far the emperor had fallen into delusion. But here's the detail that really shows the depths of Caligula's corruption, and why his sisters eventually turned against him. Behind closed doors, in the private chambers of the imperial palace, Caligula was forcing his own sisters to participate in twisted rituals that mixed political power with sexual depravity. This wasn't just about lust or even incest, though both were involved. This was about total domination, about breaking the spirits of the most powerful women in Rome and making them complicit in his madness. He used these acts as a form of psychological warfare, ensuring that his sisters were too compromised, too ashamed, too terrified to ever turn against him. Or so he thought. What Caligula didn't realize was that by pushing his sisters to this breaking point, he was creating his own executioners. Every twisted night, every humiliating ritual, every moment of powerless rage was building towards something explosive. The very women he thought he had completely broken were quietly, carefully planning his destruction. The emperor, who believed himself untouchable, had just created three of the most dangerous enemies in Roman history. Now let's talk about the three women who would dare to challenge a god emperor. These weren't just any Roman women. They were Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, and Livilla, the most powerful sisters in the ancient world. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, they had been raised expecting luxury, influence, and respect. What they got instead was a nightmare that would transform them from victims into would-be assassins. But here's where this story gets truly heartbreaking. Among the three sisters, there was one who held a special place in Caligula's twisted heart, Drusilla. She wasn't just his sister. She was his obsession, his favorite, the woman he claimed to love above all others. Ancient sources tell us that Caligula's relationship with Drusilla went far beyond the already disturbing dynamics he had with his other sisters. He showered her with gifts, gave her unprecedented political influence, and even had coins minted with her face on them, something virtually unheard of for a woman in ancient Rome. Drusilla was living proof of just how far Caligula had fallen from Roman values. In a society that prized family honor above almost everything else, the emperor was openly flaunting his incestuous relationship with his sister. Some historians believe she was the only person who could actually influence his decisions, the only one who could sometimes talk him out of his most extreme impulses. But in 38 years after Christ, just 1 year after Caligula's mysterious illness, something terrible happened. Drusilla died suddenly and under circumstances so suspicious that even 2,000 years later, historians still debate what really happened. The official cause was fever, but whispers immediately began circulating through the marble halls of the Palatine Hill. Was it poison? Had Caligula finally gone too far, even for his beloved sister? Or had Drusilla discovered something so dangerous that it sealed her fate? Here's what makes Drusilla's death even more chilling. Caligula's reaction. Instead of grieving like a normal brother, he completely lost what was left of his sanity. He declared Drusilla a goddess, ordered the entire empire to worship her, and made it a capital crime to laugh, bathe, or dine with your family during the mourning period. Imagine that. An entire empire forced to grieve for a woman who might have been murdered by her own brother. But the most telling detail? Caligula claimed he could still speak with Drusilla's spirit. He would hold long conversations with her statue, asking for advice on political matters. Whether this was genuine madness or a calculated performance, it terrified everyone who witnessed it. With Drusilla gone, Agrippina and Livilla suddenly found themselves in an incredibly dangerous position. They had lost their sister, possibly their protector, and now they were alone with a brother who was becoming more unstable by the day. And here's where fear turned into desperate calculation. Both sisters quickly realized that without Drusilla's moderating influence, Caligula was spiraling toward complete madness. They watched as he became increasingly paranoid, seeing enemies everywhere, ordering executions on a whim. The man who had once been their brother was now a stranger who happened to wear the imperial purple. The final straw came when they discovered something absolutely chilling. Agrippina and Livilla learned that Caligula kept a private diary, not of his thoughts or daily activities, but of people he planned to execute. And there, written in his own hand, were their names. Think about that for a moment. Your own brother, the most powerful man in the world, has literally written your death sentence and is just waiting for the right moment to carry it out. This wasn't paranoia on their part. This was cold, documented evidence that they were living on borrowed time. The discovery of that death list changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't about family loyalty or trying to save their brother from his own madness. This was about survival. They could either wait passively for Caligula to decide their fate, or they could take control of their destiny. And so, in the shadows of the imperial palace, two of Rome's most powerful women began to plot the unthinkable. They would kill their brother before he could kill them. The hunters had become the hunted, and the game was about to turn deadly. But here's the tragic irony. By pushing his sisters to this breaking point, Caligula had created exactly the kind of conspiracy he feared most. The very paranoia that led him to put their names in his death diary had driven them to actually become the threat he imagined they were. The emperor's greatest enemies weren't foreign kings or rebellious generals. They were the women who had once shared his bed and his secrets, and who now knew exactly how to destroy him. With their names written in Caligula's death diary, Agrippina and Livilla knew they had to act fast. But how do you kill the most powerful man in the world? How do you murder someone who sleeps with a sword under his pillow, who trusts no one, and who's surrounded by the Praetorian Guard day and night? The answer came to them in a moment of dark poetry. 3 sisters, 3 daggers, 3 equal shares of an empire's future. This wasn't just going to be an assassination. It was going to be a statement, a symbol that power should be divided, not concentrated in the hands of one mad tyrant. Here's how their plan was supposed to unfold. The sisters would wait for one of Caligula's infamous banquets, those decadent feasts where the emperor would drink heavily, let his guard down, and indulge in his twisted pleasures. These weren't just dinner parties. They were displays of absolute power where senators were forced to watch humiliating performances, where enemies were sometimes executed between courses, and where anything could happen. The beauty of their plan was its simplicity. During the height of the festivities, when Caligula was drunk and distracted, the 3 sisters would approach him together. Each would be carrying a ceremonial dagger hidden beneath their robes. At a predetermined signal, they would strike simultaneously. 3 blades, 3 wounds, 3 women reclaiming their power from the monster who had stolen their dignity. But here's the chilling detail that shows just how far they were willing to go. These weren't just any daggers. Ancient sources suggest the sisters had the blades blessed in a dark ritual, consecrating them to the gods of vengeance. They weren't just planning murder, they were performing what they saw as a sacred act of justice. The symbolism was perfect. 3 daggers representing the 3 sisters, but also representing the 3 branches of power that Caligula had corrupted: military, religious, and civil authority. By killing him together, they weren't just committing fratricide. They were performing a kind of political sacrifice to save the empire from his madness. And you know what? The plan might actually have worked. Caligula, despite all his paranoia, had one fatal weakness: his arrogance. He genuinely believed his sisters were too broken, too terrified, too dependent on him to ever pose a real threat. In his twisted mind, the very women he had brutalized were also his most trusted confidants. But here's where our story takes a devastating turn, because even the best-laid plans can be destroyed by human greed and betrayal. Enter Protogenes, a freedman who had worked his way into the conspiracy. In ancient Rome, freedmen were former slaves who had earned or bought their freedom, but they still lived in a precarious position between the slave class and full citizens. Protogenes had somehow convinced the sisters that he could be trusted, that his hatred for Caligula matched their own. What the sisters didn't know was that Protogenes was playing a much more dangerous game. He saw an opportunity not just to survive, but to profit from both sides of this deadly conspiracy. Imagine the calculation running through his mind. He could either risk everything on a dangerous assassination plot, or he could betray the conspirators and earn the emperor's gratitude, along with all the wealth and status that would bring. So Protogenes made his choice. Just days before the planned assassination, he went directly to Caligula and revealed everything. Every detail of the plot, every name of the conspirators, every aspect of the plan that the sisters had trusted him with. Can you imagine the emperor's reaction? Here was confirmation of his worst paranoia. His own sisters really were plotting to kill him. But instead of fear, Caligula felt a twisted kind of vindication. He had been right to suspect them, right to put their names in his death diary, right to sleep with a sword under his pillow every night. And here's a chilling detail that shows just how deep Caligula's paranoia ran. Ancient sources tell us that he did indeed sleep with a weapon within reach every single night. The man who proclaimed himself a god lived in constant terror of assassination. He trusted no one completely, not even his own sisters, and that paranoia had just saved his life. But the betrayal of Protogenes raises a fascinating question about loyalty, survival, and moral choices in impossible circumstances. Here's what I want you to think about. Who was really the villain in this story? Was it Caligula, the tyrant who drove his own family to plot his murder? Was it the sisters, who were willing to commit fratricide to save themselves and possibly the empire? Or was it Protogenes, who betrayed the trust of desperate women to save his own skin? If you're enjoying this twisted tale of family betrayal and imperial madness, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Who do you think was the real villain here? Caligula, the mad emperor, or his sisters who plotted his death? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on this impossible moral dilemma. The discovery of the Three Daggers plot unleashed a storm of vengeance that would make Caligula's previous cruelties look like gentle warnings. When the emperor learned that his own sisters had planned to murder him, something inside his already fractured mind completely shattered. The paranoid tyrant became something even worse, a wounded animal lashing out at everyone within reach. But here's what made Caligula's revenge so particularly cruel. He didn't just want to punish the conspirators. He wanted to destroy them in the most psychologically devastating way possible. For Roman aristocrats, especially women of the imperial family, there were fates far worse than a quick death, and Caligula knew exactly how to inflict maximum suffering. Agrippina and Livilla were stripped of everything that defined their identity: their titles, their wealth, their status, their homes. All of it vanished overnight, but the real punishment was yet to come. Caligula sentenced them to exile on the Pontine Islands, a group of barren, windswept rocks off the Italian coast that served as Rome's most dreaded prison for political enemies. Now, you might think exile doesn't sound so terrible, but for women who had lived their entire lives in marble palaces, surrounded by hundreds of servants and the finest luxuries the ancient world could offer, this was a living death. The Pontine Islands were essentially a desert surrounded by water. No trees, barely any fresh water, scorching hot in summer and brutally cold in winter. These women who had once dined on delicacies from across the empire now had to survive on stale bread and whatever fish they could catch. But the psychological torture was even worse than the physical hardship. Imagine going from being among the most powerful women in the world to having absolutely nothing. No influence, no contact with the outside world, no hope of rescue. They were completely cut off from civilization, left to slowly waste away while knowing their brother was still alive and still ruling the empire they had tried to save. Yet Caligula's thirst for blood wasn't satisfied with just punishing his sisters. The failed assassination plot had confirmed his worst fears. If his own family could betray him, then everyone was a potential enemy. What followed was one of the most brutal purges in Roman history. The emperor ordered mass executions that swept through the highest levels of Roman society like a plague. Senators who had never even heard of the plot found themselves dragged before tribunals and condemned to death. Distant relatives of the imperial family, people who had lived quiet lives far from politics, suddenly discovered that sharing blood with the conspirators was now a capital crime. Here's a detail that shows just how far Caligula's paranoia had spread. He didn't just execute the obvious suspects. He went after their friends, their servants, even people who had simply been seen talking to them in public. Ancient sources tell us that some victims were killed simply because they had attended the same dinner parties as the conspirators months earlier. The blood flowed so freely that even hardened Roman politicians, who were used to political violence, began to whisper that their emperor had completely lost his mind. But no one dared speak these thoughts aloud, because whispers had a way of reaching Caligula's ears, and reaching his ears was now a death sentence. But here's where this story takes an absolutely incredible turn that shows how unpredictable history can be. While Livilla would die in exile, forgotten and broken, Agrippina somehow managed to survive. Not just survive, but eventually return to Rome and reclaim a position of power that would make her one of the most influential women in Roman history. You see, Caligula himself was assassinated just a few years later, in 41 years after Christ, and the new emperor Claudius, who happened to be Agrippina's uncle, recalled her from exile. She married Claudius, became empress, and then pulled off one of the most audacious power plays in ancient history. She convinced her new husband to adopt her son from a previous marriage, making that boy the heir to the Roman throne. That boy's name? Nero. Yes, that Nero, the emperor who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned, who killed his own mother, and who became synonymous with tyranny and madness. Think about the incredible irony here. Agrippina, who had failed to kill one mad emperor, ended up creating another one. The woman who had risked everything to save Rome from her brother's madness ultimately gave birth to a reign of terror that would make Caligula look almost reasonable by comparison. It's as if history itself was playing some cosmic joke. The conspiracy that was supposed to end imperial madness actually set in motion the events that would produce an even worse tyrant. Agrippina's revenge against her brother came not through daggers in the dark, but through the son who would eventually surpass Caligula's reputation for cruelty and excess. And in the ultimate twist of fate, that same son, Nero, would eventually have his own mother murdered, completing a cycle of family violence that had begun with the Three Daggers plot. The blood that Caligula had spilled in his paranoid rage would continue to flow for generations, proving that in the imperial family, blood truly never dried. The Three Daggers plot had failed, but in a twisted way, it had accomplished something the sisters never intended. It had planted the seeds of Caligula's own destruction. You see, discovering that his own sisters wanted him dead didn't just make the emperor more cruel. It made him completely, utterly paranoid. And paranoia, as any tyrant will tell you, is a poison that eventually consumes its host. After the failed assassination attempt, Caligula began to see enemies everywhere. Every smile was hiding a dagger. Every conversation was a potential conspiracy. Every person who looked at him too long was plotting his death. The emperor, who had once reveled in public appearances, now moved through his own palace like a hunted animal, trusting absolutely no one. This wasn't just uncomfortable for Caligula, it was destroying the very foundations of Roman government. The empire functioned on a complex web of relationships, alliances, and mutual respect between the emperor and the ruling class. But how can you run an empire when you suspect everyone around you is a potential assassin? The domino effect was swift and devastating. Caligula started making increasingly erratic decisions, changing his mind about policies from one day to the next, promoting and then executing officials on a whim. He would summon senators to meetings and then spend the entire time studying their faces, looking for signs of treachery that existed only in his fractured mind. But here's the cruel irony. By treating everyone as a potential enemy, Caligula was actually creating the very conspiracies he feared. When you tell a man he's going to be executed for treason he didn't commit, you give him every reason to actually commit treason. When you destroy someone's career and threaten their family for imaginary plots, you force them to consider real plots just to survive. The man who was most affected by this spiral of paranoia was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard. Now, Chaerea was exactly the kind of person you'd want protecting you, a decorated military veteran, absolutely loyal to Rome, someone who had served the imperial family faithfully for years. But Caligula's paranoia had warped his judgment so completely that he began to see this loyal soldier as a threat. The emperor started humiliating Chaerea in public, questioning his loyalty, giving him passwords that were deliberately offensive and demeaning. Imagine being a respected military officer and being forced to use passwords like "kiss me" or other degrading phrases designed to break your spirit and make you look foolish in front of your own troops. But Chaerea was a survivor of the purges that had followed the Three Daggers plot. He had watched as senators, fellow guards, and even distant relatives of the imperial family were dragged away to execution. He knew that in Caligula's Rome, being innocent meant nothing. Being loyal meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the emperor's whim, and that whim could turn deadly at any moment. So Chaerea began to do exactly what Caligula suspected he was doing. He started plotting. But this wasn't the amateur conspiracy of desperate sisters. This was a professional military operation planned by someone who knew exactly how the Praetorian Guard operated and exactly where Caligula was most vulnerable. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. On January 24th, in the year 41 after Christ, Caligula was attending theatrical games in a temporary wooden theater. At midday, he decided to leave for lunch, walking through a narrow underground passage that connected the theater to his private chambers. It was the perfect trap. The passage was narrow, limiting the number of bodyguards who could protect him. It was private, away from the crowds who might witness the assassination. And most importantly, it was predictable. Caligula always used the same route at the same time. Chaerea and his fellow conspirators were waiting. When the emperor entered the passage, they struck with military precision, multiple stab wounds, just like the sisters had planned. But this time there was no betrayal, no last-minute revelation to save the tyrant's life. Caligula died as he had lived in his final years, in violence, paranoia, and blood. The man who had declared himself a god was butchered like an animal in a dark tunnel beneath a theater. The emperor, who had slept with a sword under his pillow, was killed by the very guards who were supposed to protect him. But here's the most chilling detail of all. When Chaerea delivered the fatal blow, he reportedly shouted, "Take that!" using the same demeaning password that Caligula had forced him to use. It was the ultimate act of revenge, turning the emperor's own humiliation back on him in his final moments. The Three Daggers plot had failed, but it had set in motion a chain of events that made Caligula's death inevitable. The paranoia that began with his sister's betrayal had grown like a cancer, consuming everyone around him until finally, it consumed him too. In the end, Caligula's greatest enemy wasn't his sisters, wasn't foreign invaders, wasn't even political rivals. His greatest enemy was the monster he had become, and the fear that monster created in every person who was forced to live under his rule. The emperor who had tried to become a god had forgotten the most basic truth of power, that those who rule by fear will eventually be destroyed by it. So here we are at the end of our dark journey through the Three Daggers plot, and I have to ask you, what have we really learned from this tale of sisters, daggers, and imperial madness? The Three Daggers plot wasn't just a failed assassination attempt. It was something much more significant. It was a symptom of an empire that had become sick with absolute power. Think about it for a moment. When a political system becomes so corrupted that sisters feel compelled to murder their own brother just to survive, when paranoia replaces governance, when fear becomes the primary tool of leadership, that's not just one man's madness. That's an entire civilization crying out that something is fundamentally broken. And here's the truly chilling part. This wasn't the end of the cycle. Rome would repeat this same deadly pattern over and over again throughout the centuries that followed. Mad emperors, desperate conspiracies, bloody betrayals, and violent ends. Caligula was followed by Claudius, who was poisoned. Then came Nero, who drove the empire to the brink of civil war. Then more tyrants, more plots, more blood flowing through the marble halls of power. It's as if Rome had become addicted to its own dysfunction, unable to break free from a cycle that everyone could see was destroying the very foundations of civilization. The same families that produced great leaders also produced monsters. The same system that created the greatest empire in human history also created the conditions for its own destruction. But here's what I want you to think about as you go about your day, as you watch the news, as you observe the world around you. Can you see these same patterns playing out today? Different countries, different technologies, different weapons perhaps, but the same fundamental human dynamics. Leaders who become drunk on power, systems that reward paranoia over competence, families and friendships destroyed by political ambition, the slow corruption of institutions that were meant to protect people, not control them. The ancient Romans thought they were so different from the barbarians beyond their borders, so much more civilized, so much more advanced. But in the end, they fell victim to the same human weaknesses that have destroyed civilizations throughout history: the hunger for absolute power and the fear of losing it. And that brings us to perhaps the most important lesson from our story today. When leaders begin to see themselves not as servants of their people, but as gods among mortals, when they start to believe their own propaganda about being indispensable and infallible, when they surround themselves with yes men and eliminate anyone who dares to question their judgment, well, that's when you know the altar of destruction is already being built. Because here's the truth that Caligula learned too late. When leaders become gods, the only altar possible is their own ruin. Power that recognizes no limits will eventually be limited by the very people it seeks to control. Fear that knows no boundaries will eventually create the courage needed to cross those boundaries. And paranoia that sees enemies everywhere will eventually create real enemies who have nothing left to lose. The Three Daggers plot failed, but the forces it represented, the human desire for dignity, for justice, for freedom from tyranny, those forces are eternal. They can be suppressed, they can be delayed, they can be driven underground, but they can never be permanently destroyed. They will always find a way to surface, whether through the desperate actions of three sisters with daggers or through the calculated precision of a military tribune with a sword. This story happened nearly 2,000 years ago, but it's as relevant today as it was when Agrippina first sharpened her blade in the shadows of the Palatine Hill. Because human nature hasn't changed, the temptations of power haven't changed, and neither has the price that must eventually be paid when those temptations are allowed to run unchecked. If this journey into the darkness of imperial Rome has made you think, if it's opened your eyes to patterns you might not have noticed before, then it's accomplished exactly what history is supposed to do. Hit that like button and share this story with anyone who loves to explore the lessons that the past has to teach us. Subscribe to Imperium Chronicles and join us as we continue to dive deep into the secrets, scandals, and shocking truths that shaped our world. Because remember, those who forget history aren't just doomed to repeat it. They're doomed to repeat it without even realizing they're doing it. And that, my friends, is a fate far worse than any conspiracy, any betrayal, or any dagger in the dark. Until our next journey into the shadows of the past, keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Not just against external enemies, but against the monsters that power can create within ourselves. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through one of history's most shocking family betrayals. I'll see you in the next episode of Imperium Chronicles, where the past comes alive and the lessons of history speak directly to our modern world.